It's a pleasure to welcome you to the talk just right before the lunch break. So I hope you're still all awake and looking forward for the talk. It's my pleasure to introduce Adam, who's waiting here on the right side. Adam is a scientific researcher at the TSG lab in Hoffenheim. He did his bachelor thesis at the University of Newcastle on the effects of precursors on decision-making in soccer, followed by a PhD at the Universität des Saarlandes about perceptual and cognitive assessment in football. During his PhD, he was at the FIFA Medical of Excellence, assisting in health and performance testing with individual, in clinic and athletics patients and professional team sports athletes. Adam conducted his PhD alongside TSG Hoffenheim on developing the latest technologies to best measure and train athletes' performance in soccer together with scientific approaches. With the newly opened TSG Research Lab, Adam continued to build on his work by evaluating the practical value of the technologies in sport and whether we can transfer this knowledge to other areas of the society. And we are looking forward to your talk. Adam, please.
Thank you, guys. Okay, I'm going to push start on the clock here because I know Germans like to be pünktlich, and so do I. Okay, thanks, Mark, for the nice introduction, and thanks, TNG, for having me. As Mark said, that I'm Adam, and I come from Australia, the land down under, and I made my way to Germany to basically try to push innovation in football. And so today I'm going to be talking to you guys about the technological advancements in football and providing you guys with some insights and lessons learned from the TSG Research Lab. Before I talk about what is the TSG Research Lab, I have to give you guys a bit of a context of the mother company that it stems from, which is TSG Hoffenheim. And for those that are not football fans in the audience, TSG Hoffenheim is a football club that competes at the first division of football in Germany. But it's situated, importantly, in a small town called Zuzenhausen. And Zuzenhausen, yeah, with the laugh, suggests that it's basically a population of more than just over 3,000 people. And most of them are farmers, and often the Lamborghinis get stuck behind the tractors, which is always funny. But what it represents in the photo below is that the large football club basically takes up about 1/5 of the space of this village. And so when you think about why would a 16-year-old talented athlete come to this village to improve themselves in football, you also have to talk about why would they leave a club, or why would they stay at Hoffenheim and not go to another bigger club with more tradition? And so not only are we competing against keeping talent for within the academy, we're also saying that these are still 16-year-old adolescent guys. They want to have a social life. They want to go out and drink beers by the Visa. And so not only are we competing against bigger clubs, we're competing against the cities that they're living in, okay? And then I think that's really important because in order to keep the talent within the football club, we have to demonstrate that we have a proof of concept. Now, hopefully all the eyes light up here because you should recognize Nicholas Süle, who joined Hoffenheim in 2010, sitting there in his purple t-shirt. Okay, so he grew his football skills at Hoffenheim and then was sold to Bayern Munich and also plays for the German national team. So you're welcome. The other proof of concept, we have many, but Nadi Mamiri is another good example. He joined us 1 year later at 2011 and again sold to Leverkusen. But he also developed at the TSG Hoffenheim and also plays for the national team. In 2018, Hoffenheim basically first had its taste of Champions League football. For those that don't know that, that's the highest level of competition for football in Europe. And we were lucky or unlucky to be greeted with Liverpool and Manchester City within the group stage. And these are giants of European football, especially the Premier League champions as well of the recent years. And BBC caught note of this when the giants of England come to this small village in Zuzenhausen, and they're saying, what on earth is happening here? How is it possible that a population of 3,000 people are competing against the likes of the giants of European football? And what are we doing differently? And so they wrote a nice article and they called us the Friendly Club, which is nice because we're very family orientated. But it's what they mean by doing things differently is that we have this desire to be the real drivers of innovation in football and to try to push the boundaries of what is the norm in football and seeing how we can think outside the box and really drive innovation within the club. We're also a relatively young club with a lot of young staff, such as myself. And we want to say, hey, we don't care about the traditional norms. We want to really push the boundaries of technology and bring the youth kind of energy into really pushing the club to the next level. And so for the next part of the presentation, I'm going to be demonstrating the pillars of the philosophy or the vision of the club itself and how we both design, develop, and integrate this type of technology within the club, and how do we use this on a day-to-day basis in order to help with the decision-making that we have to do. And so the first one I'm going to be focusing on is what is TSG Hoffenheim's vision towards innovation. Now, to discuss where the vision comes from, we have to give you guys a bit of context of the history of the club. Now, in 2000, Hoffenheim was still competing in the 5th division of football, and that is not a professional league within Germany. Only the top 4 is. And so I think that TNG was also created around the same time, in roughly about 20 years ago. Okay, so both TNG and Hoffenheim have rose through the ranks to where we are today. But basically in 2008, there was a rapid rise into the 1st division of German football. And in 2018, that's when they qualified for the Champions League, which is where the BBC article came into play. And I think that this rapid rise of gaining into the 1st division of football has not really been demonstrated before. And I know maybe a lot of Bayern Munich fans are a little bit angry about that, but it's okay. But we can talk about the positives of that, is that this club doesn't necessarily have the traditions as to other big clubs in Germany. And what that allows us to do is being a lot more innovative with our ideas because we don't have the traditional constraints that other clubs might have. So there's no one at the top of the board saying, well, when we won the league, we didn't have this type of technology, so why should we have that now? Or, when I was a player back in my day, we didn't have any of this and we still won the league. So why should we invest our time and money into these type of projects? And that's really important because this is, again, what separates Hoffenheim apart. And what's also really important is that I personally believe that culture rolls downhill. And the reason why I put the 2 CEOs of Hoffenheim and the research lab on there is because they're both well-known drivers of innovation. So Professor Jan Meyer, he's been the sports psychologist for the last 15 years of Hoffenheim, and he was recently promoted to the CEO of the club itself, and he's also the CEO of the research lab. And Jan Spielmann, he spent 7 years sitting in the same office as Jan Meyer, and so I'm sure that it was very influenced in his drive in order to push innovation in the club. And a little side note, Professor Meyer was also the sports psychologist for Mark as he was competing in the Paralympics as well. So it's a nice circle of how I came here today. In order to continue to progress and challenge the current model that we have, although it's working, we need to continue to look to the future and to do something different. And in 2020, they created the TSG Research Lab, which is basically an independent science department on the grounds of the club, but we do not have the agenda to serve the club itself. So the relationship between the research lab and Hoffenheim is symbiotic in the way that we are allowed to have full access for the data of the club. We do not own it, and we cannot use the data to make inferences in order to improve the athletes itself. And I think that's really important. But what we can do is take all of the lessons learned from football and technology and innovation in order to apply it to several other domains. And so an example would be, how do we measure the brains of an athlete, and can we transfer that into a clinical situation? And I'll get onto that in the future. We also have a main sponsor, which is SAP, and this is a well-known company that also strives for innovation, and we engage in a lot of projects with them as well, which I'll talk to you guys about in a few slides. Now, Professor Meyer, through his rise through the ranks of Hoffenheim has had this basically this model about how do we break down decision making in football, and how can we categorize that in order to really put all of our emphasis of our technology and our kind of scientific impact into which part of this model. And so the input process output model, basically it tries to explain that we look at stuff in the environment, we pick up informational cues from our environment. We have both conscious and subconscious processes that are constantly processing this type of information and making it meaningful to interpret. And then we have the output, which is actually our behavior. And so the output is more about the action that other people can see, and it's the result of the first two steps of the input process. So the main thing, I guess, to explain the model in a better context is to try to explain what does output look like in a football decision-making context. And this is probably the easiest one to work backwards. So output is observable actions on the field. And in 2013, this was the first to market. I'm sure many people here maybe have heard of what's known as the football now. And so this was the first real innovative type of technology that Hoffenheim integrated within the club itself. And what this tries to do is it tries to put football technique and assess that in a controlled environment. And the reason why I use the word controlled is because us as scientists, we need reliable and very controlled environments in order to have trustworthy data. Because the problem is football is very messy. And no pun intended, but the idea behind that is that if you can try to isolate a specific technique of the player away from all the confounding variables that might influence that, then we can actually start to really narrow down how good this player is in terms of their technical skill. So what I think that's really interesting is that my first study of my PhD actually focused on using the football now in order to measure the technical abilities of all the athletes across the academy. And I think that this was really a groundbreaking moment for the club, and also, personally me as a researcher, is that what this demonstrated is that although we are really pushing the boundaries of technology in football, that we're also freely publishing this type of information into a scientific domain. And that's really important because everyone can access this data. And so it's very often where I'm sure if you try to go into Bayern Munich and say, hey, can I have all your data? I think that they would probably close the door on you. But what's really interesting about Hoffenheim is that they believe that we should have a lot of insights into the data that comes from multiple experts, also external to our internal group of individuals. And you can get that by publishing your research in peer-reviewed articles. And let me tell you, it's a difficult business. But I really like this kind of concept of openness of our data. And in order to also try to play around with the observable actions, we can also play around with how we basically provide feedback on the observable actions. And so, a way that we were able to do that is there is a huge TV screen, as you can see, that basically is a large TV screen based on the first team's pitch. And the match analysis can stand up on the tower and record everything that's happening live. And if a coach doesn't like something, or he wants to comment on something, then all the players can stop in their position on the field, and then they can look to wherever the screen is. And then the match analysis can go 30 seconds back and say, okay, let's rewind and see what happens. And the coach can talk about that directly as it happened. And I think that's a really interesting way, because we're not changing the type of feedback that we're delivering. We're just changing the timing as to when we deliver it. And so it's pretty often that after the training session, then the match analysis would cut all the different clips, and then they would present it in the conference room after the players have showered, they've had lunch, and then 2 hours post-training. And that's kind of a delayed feedback, because you can't really act on that until the next training, which might be in 1 day or 2 days or something. Whereas this is an immediate feedback on your observable actions. The next type of method in order to present the observable actions to the players is trying to work on the engagement that we have with these stakeholders, whether that's coaches or athletes or people who are interested in looking at our data. And so recently, this is also in the TSG Research Lab, which is a new interactive data space in cooperation with SAP. And the idea behind that is that it tries to use or present the data in a more immersive approach that engages the individuals to actually focus on the conversation and not lose their attention. And so as you can see that on the top photo, that huge glass panel is actually the largest glass panel in the world. And it's also interactive as well. So not the fact that it's the largest glass panel, but the fact that it's interactive makes it the largest interactive glass panel. And what's also interesting is that as the players sit down on these chairs, that every panel in front of them is also touchscreen and interactive. And the idea behind that is we have so many different types of personalities and so many different types of characteristics and questions throughout the team that if a player wants to focus on a specific type of data, then they can explore the data themselves and find answers to questions that they have rather than just waiting for the coach to talk about that. And I really think that it also has the wow effect as well. So when people enter this room, they say, okay, I'm here to learn. And I think it really sets a nice environment as to when people enter this room, it's like a library. They are there to explore data and learn about their performance. The limitation with only looking at observable actions is that there's a bit of discussion about how meaningful one can interpret the findings. And so Christopher Clemens, who is the head of the German Football Association match analysis department, famously quoted that we increasingly have the impression that there is a lack of data that really tells you how to be successful in football. And I think one of the best examples of how to prove this quote from him is to demonstrate the famous 2014 semifinal stage of the World Cup between Germany and Brazil. Now, I start seeing a whole bunch of people light up because, of course, it's a great memory. And I probably don't have to explain to a room full of Germans what the result of this game was. But what I want to point your attention to is that in football, we use our what's called key performance indicators, which is a performance indicator of how well somebody is competing in the sport. And so when you look at the key performance indicators that I've listed here, you can see that Brazil normally have the better key performance indicators. So they're more in favor of Brazil. They have more shots on target, they have higher ball possession, they have more dangerous attacks. And so you would assume that maybe Brazil would have won this game. But of course, as we know, that it was nothing but the opposite. The data can also be interpreted subjectively. And I think that's really important because although the data can be objective, the person who's interpreting it might have their own biases as to how to best look at the data. And so if you previously asked somebody what the central role of a central defender is, they might say, well, the best thing a central defender can do is run back and slide tackle the striker right before he gets the ball off, and shoots the ball at the target. And that was a glory phase where that was really something that people prized. But in today's game, that same movement of slide tackling is actually now a sign of recovering from an error. Okay, so if somebody has to slide tackle, it means that they've made a mistake. And the reason why is because the new role of a central defender might be to be in a better position in order to stop that pass from even happening. So maybe they intercept the ball, or maybe they were in a better position where that striker was not even considered in the decision-making process of the midfielder. Okay, and so I think that as the game progresses, so does the opinions and the subjective interpretation of the data does too. And a nice way to demonstrate probably why that the subjective interpretations are changing between the staff and people who are interested in football is because how fast the speed of the game is changing. So in the 2006 World Cup, the average per player possession time, so the ball possession time, was 2.9 seconds, which means that the player received the ball, they looked around, and then they made a decision. Okay, and then they actually shot the ball to wherever it needed to be. If you fast forward to the 2014 World Cup, where they actually won, of course, I know you guys already know this, but it was less than a second. And this to me represents that in 8 years, there was a threefold decrease in the time spent for an athlete to receive the ball, make a decision, make their decision, and also act accordingly. So the IPO model of the players are completely put under pressure. And it's amazing to see how fast the speed of the game and the speed of athletes thinking is accelerating. And so you have to think to yourself, if that all happened in 8 years, well, what will the next 8 years bring? And are we going to be preparing the athletes to make decisions at such fast times in 8 years? And are we as coaches or practitioners or scientists able to evaluate whether players will be able to handle the demands of the game in the future? And so this rolls in nicely as to what innovative initiatives are we prioritizing and why. And so if we know that there's a lot of limitations on the observable actions on the field, then maybe we should be looking towards the other two parts of the decision-making process, which is the input and the process part of the model. And so I'm going to work again backwards and focus on the processes. Now, in order to try to measure how an athlete is actually processing their brains, that we've put a lot of investment over the last 5 years to actually design, develop, and apply these type of cognitive assessments in our research lab. And so over the last 5 years, we have been measuring all of the players from the under 12s to the professional team, both the males and the females, on various aspects of their brain. And we've been doing that twice a year because, of course, preseason and during season. But what's also interesting is that we've made a real effort in order to try to recruit other levels of football performance. So the surrounding clubs that maybe are the less elite players, okay? Because we would like to know whether there's a differences in the cognitive abilities of the lower level athletes and the elite level athletes. But we're also interested in measuring other sports such as swimming, ice hockey, basketball. All of these athlete teams are coming into the research lab to get their brains tested. And what we're doing is we're accumulating a lot of data a lot of data in the sports science domain. Let me put that straight. We're accumulating a lot of data and trying to see whether there are patterns emerging between various cognitive abilities that might underline success in sport. And the type of cognitive abilities that I'm referring to are probably terms that you guys have all heard of before. So the first one is our working memory. This is not athlete specific, this is human specific. And this helps us to problem solve, make better decisions because we're considering all of the relevant information in the situation and integrating that with our previous experience. And so, for instance, if you have encountered a similar situation 2 weeks ago, what was the response that you did? And was that positive or negative? And should you do it again or should you change your behavior? And an example of how this would apply on a sporting field is that athletes would so the coach would give an athlete at halftime instructions, say, I want you to do this when this happens. The athlete has to go back onto the field and hold that information in the mind. And then at the exact moment when the situation is congruent with the instructions that the coach delivered, then they actually have to turn that verbal information into a meaningful action. And that process is how athletes complete that is through their working memory. The next one is cognitive flexibility. And this is the ability of humans to help shift our attention to relevant stimuli. It shifts our attention to a new task or when our priorities change, and also to adapt to new rules. And this allows athletes to be creative in their decisions, to change up tactics when something isn't working. Can they overcome the defenders by doing something different? It also helps people to think outside the box. And the last one is response inhibition. And I'm sure everybody has dealt with response inhibition, which is where you have to control your attention and your behavior, and you have to regulate your emotions and prevent yourself from making a false decision or saying something or not saying something in an inappropriate time, okay? So it's that feeling of holding yourself back internally before you actually do something irresponsible. And this is the same on the football pitch. So maybe an athlete in such a high-pressured, high emotional environment that they would go up and scream at the referee and then get a yellow card, and that would jeopardize the game. And what I wanted to show you guys this video is because although that athletes are having to kind of take in so much information from the from the environment is that they actually have to also suppress a lot of information. And the reason why this is funny is because it doesn't happen very often. And the reason why it doesn't happen very often is because this is how we start appreciating how good athletes are at negating information that is not meaningful to their decision-making process. And for people who didn't get that, that's a security guard wearing the same tricot color. And there was a nice meta-analysis done over the last 10 years or so, which basically demonstrated collectively that 19 research papers are pointing to the same thing that we are also, or they're supporting our innovative methods in football, and which is basically demonstrated that the elite level athletes, the people that are the best at what they do, also appear to have superior cognitive functions than the lower level athletes, and also, unfortunately, people like myself who are non-athlete populations. And so when you start realizing that there is actually something about this type of technology to measure the cognitive abilities of athletes, and you can say, okay, well, now that we're starting to understand what cognitive abilities are relevant for high performance sport, then we can start employing this in more of like a scouting tool, for instance, and looking for all of the different people that have similar cognitive abilities, or maybe more importantly, that don't have similar cognitive abilities. And I think it's really important as well is that when I'm talking about the cognitive aspects, that I want you guys not to lose sight that we're also looking at the athlete in a more of a holistic approach. And so we never look at the cognitive abilities of the athletes in isolation, that we always have to remember that the brain is within a body. And so, of course, we are integrating this all with the physical parameters that every other football club does as well. So we would measure how far they run, or how technical they are in the foot one out, for instance, how high they jump or how fast they sprint. But what I think is important is that a lot of football clubs are really, really good at all the physical attributes, but they're terrible at understanding what are the cognitive attributes that underline success in football. We know that fast sprinting and having a good endurance is really good for football, but what are those same aspects in the brain? And I think Hoffenheim, because we started so early on this type of innovation, we have a lot of data that really, allows us to kind of have the head start in terms of understanding the cognition of the athletes. Now, it's all good and well that we collect all of this data, and we have a huge amount of data that we would like to share with lots of people within the club, but also externally in science. But how have we ensured, and how do we continue to ensure that this technology stays useful and relevant within the club? How do we ensure that practitioners and coaches and players will actually show up to the research lab and continue to provide their data to us in order to help benefit both the football club, but also greater society as well? And I think it probably comes down to making a lot of mistakes. So in my first year, I was a PhD student, and I was really excited because I looked at all the cognitive data on the left side here, about all the athletes from the under 12s to the under 19. So it's pretty much all the kids in the academy. And I was really excited to show the coach. And I showed him all these different graphs, and he looked at me and he was like, oh, mate, I have no idea what I'm looking at. And it was my first kind of realistic example or encounter with the fact that I'm not speaking the language of the coach, I'm speaking the language of science. And there's often this gap between science and practitioners that we often fail to translate our results or what we really want from one another because we're in such different domains. And so I think what I learned is that simple is often better when talking to coaches. And we have to speak the language of the coach as well. So what we did was we created on the left-hand side, which is basically a sum score of all of the different parameters that are, at the end of this equation, it basically creates an arbitrary unit. So one number is a lot easier to interpret than 10, for instance. And I think that was really important and to help overcoming this translation barrier. The other problem is that in sports science, and I'm not sure if it's the same in your guys' domain, but a lot of the time, the projects that we are working with or the domain that we are working with stays on the computers of the people working in that office. And it's very seldom that a psychologist would share the data on the computer with the medical staff, which would share the data into the academy or the first team. And there's just too many people that are placed in different offices and different buildings, and that we don't normally get to see all of the data and interpret the data. And so there's not really a clear data structure. And I know that freaks everybody out. And so we're working on it at the moment. And so we're working on building an area where all of our data can come together. And so we are experimenting with Sports One, and we have been using Sports One and trying to develop basically a platform that players and coaches can easily interact with all of their data, but also see everything from the latest match highlights to the psychology data all in one place. And this is really something that I guess would be innovative in terms of data structures within a football club. Now, I realized this morning that for some reason they decided to put Bayern Munich winning 5-0 against Hoffenheim. So I'm not sure what that was about, but when in Munich. So another way that we can try to gain the engagement and the buy-in from coaches and athletes is to demonstrate that we can actually use this type of information to identify weaknesses in the players that weren't necessarily identified before. And so if you are not measuring the cognitive abilities of the athletes, then you're blindly assuming that everybody has a good brain inside their body. And that's false, because we know that's not true with all the data that we've collected, that there are athletes that are underperforming for their cognitive abilities, which we could help hopefully to improve. And so what we would do is that this is what a regular diagnostics report would look like. Very easy. It's in Excel, nothing extreme. But we would rank them from their sum score from the top 33 performers in green to the bottom 33 performers in red. And what a coach might use this easy to understand spreadsheet is that the players in red, he maybe would send them to the sports psychologist in order to do some type of cognitive training. The people in white, maybe he would say, okay, it's recommended that you also go see the sports psychologist, but it's not forced. And the people in green, they can, have a coffee or whatever football players do in their free time. I should also mention as well that one of the philosophies of the club, and it relates back to keeping talent within the football club, is that we never use this information to try to deselect a player. So we would never identify a weakness and say, okay, well, this player does not have the cognitive strengths as the other players, and so he should not make it to the next level. They have this philosophy called talent saving rather than talent deselection, which is when you identify a weakness, you have to look to the coaches and say, how can we change our behaviors in order to help improve that player because he's a non-responder to the current methods. And I think that's really important. And we could also use it for a talent identification perspective. I think I touched briefly on this before. And so what's really interesting is that I've only put out the under 19s cognitive diagnostics report over the 2017, 18, and 19 sessions. And again, they're ranked from the best performers to the worst performers. And what I found really interesting was that the players that are highlighted in yellow are the ones that also received a professional contract within the club itself or an external club. And I know that this vastly underrepresents all the other attributes that they have, but there does seem to be an association that sparks our interest for saying, okay, maybe there is something that we're doing right with our cognitive assessments in order to say that this underlines successful performance in football. And so this really started to get the ball rolling in terms of, well, what attributes can we be using in order to start to predict whether the athlete will be successful and move throughout the academy? Because we have a lot of data of all the attributes of the athletes across 5 or 6 years. So now we're starting to accumulate longitudinal data, and this is where patterns begin to emerge. And so a university in Mannheim, they basically created a few algorithms, and they were able to say with a 70% accuracy what were the players that moved from the under 17s team in the academy successfully to the under 19 group. So it's just the next stage within the academy. There's no under 18s. And what I thought was really interesting when I was looking at these different algorithms is that highlighted in red were always cognitive attributes belonging to these models. Okay, so it does seem to be that the cognitive attributes that we are using do seem to be important within the prediction of players moving through the academy. And so this has really started to I guess, pique our interest and say, okay, we need to start putting a lot more effort into narrowing our focus towards changing big data into smart data. And smart data, for me, is preventing paralysis by analysis. So it's not going back to my first year of PhD and embarrassing myself in front of a coach. We want to have smart data that's easy to interpret, because we're also working in a football domain and not, a highly technical domain. But what we can do is we can find patterns that synthesize all of the data between the medical departments, the psychology departments, the rehab areas, the people that are, injury-free, for instance, and put that all together and use modern methods in order to try to find patterns as to who are the most likely successful performers within the academy, and then that will help us as well in terms of, personalized training for players that are not meeting those requirements, but also talent development and talent identification as well. And so we teamed up with a data science company called Beavan of recently, and I think they've analyzed the same 6 to 7 year data sets that we gave them. And what they managed to do was demonstrate the transition of big data to smart data. And what I mean by smart data is it's this ease of interpretation. And so what they did was they took all of the model factors, so the characteristics of the athlete, how old they are, what month they were born in, how fast do they run, what playing position do they play at, how many goals, et cetera, et cetera. And what they managed to do was, by analyzing all of the different players that have stayed within the academy and the attributes that they had, then they've come up with this migration probability. And the migration probability is the likelihood that an athlete with the characteristics that they currently present, how likely will they have as a chance to move successfully to the next age group within the academy. And so what a practitioner can do is easily interpret 64% and say, I need to change this. I need to do something. And what the model also allows us to do is to input for a what-if analysis. And so if we know that this athlete has a 64% chance of migrating to the next stage of the academy, then what should we do and how could we improve the likelihood? So they have a function that the practitioners can use and say, if we improve their brain speed by X amount of points, or if we improve their sprint times by this amount of points, or their blood lactate values by X amount of millimoles, then how much more of a likelihood will they have? And can we bump it up to 75%? Okay, and this really is, I believe, the next stage of data analysis within the club, but also at the research lab. And what I also think is really interesting is that they also created a ratio of brains to bronze. And so how physically dominant are their characteristics and how mentally or cognitively dominant are they? And so this athlete here would be demonstrating that he is more cognitively better than the rest of the group, but he's not necessarily physically stronger than the rest of the group. And what I'm really interested in knowing as a scientist is that what are the ages within the academy that the physical attributes are really prized, and these are the ones that are moving through the academy. And so I believe it's the taller and the stronger athletes, the ones that mature the earliest. And so, you always see the 12-year-olds walking to school, and some of them are this high and some of them are this tall. Okay. And I think that these really stand out. Again, no pun intended, but I believe that these are the ones that progress through the academy. What I'm interested in is what is the golden age where the younger kids who have had to adapt to the stronger and more athletic teammates or opponents, they become more smarter, for instance. And then what happens when they catch up in the physical parameters? So what happens when they become the same height? Now, these guys are physically tall and strong, but they're also mentally strong as well. And I want to know, what is that golden age? Because I personally believe that there has to be an age group where the cognitive abilities overtakes the physical abilities of the athletes. If anybody knows the answer to that question, please see me after. But I was talking about an external company, and when we look internally, we're also a lot of scientists, and scientists need to improve their data analysis skills in order to help better answer their questions. Unfortunately, my data abilities appeals more to the tweet that is on the screen, because I need a lot of luck. I copy a lot of my previous code, and I take very little pleasure in the coding process because I spend all my time on Stack Overflow getting abused by people who really understand coding and saying that obviously I'm not in the right place. I don't know why Stack Overflow is so mean, but regardless. But what we've done is actually to help improve the data analysis internally within the club, we've hired a computer scientist this year. And the computer scientist is going to help make better inferences with all the data. And he's also going to help teach us how we can better use software like RStudio or Python in order to help answer our scientific questions. Because again, I'm not sure how many of you guys are scientists, but you can kind of pull and tease the data in many different ways in order to answer your hypothesis. And we want to prevent that. And we want to be better at analyzing the data so that we're actually can believe the outcomes of the data and that we can publish this in the science with a good conscience. Now, the data and the computer scientist also came into the club, and he realized an essential part is that the research lab, by nature of the agreement with Hoffenheim, is that we have access to the data, but we don't own it. And the problem with that, although it's very beneficial, is that we don't really have a clear model structure that is ours. And what we want to do is we want to establish a better means of generating access to different data sources. And he was coaching me about this on the lead up to this conversation. And he said, well, maybe we could do that with federated learning. And I'm hoping by seeing the nods in the crowd that you guys understand federated learning a lot more than I do. But from my basic understanding, from what I understand is we have a machine learning algorithm and that we would like to employ that into other football clubs' data structures. And then that by learning by other different data structures within different academies with different biases and different athletes, then we can help refine the parameters and the weights of these parameters within our own machine learning algorithm. And I'm sure lots of people are wondering, well, how are you ever going to get a team in Portugal to basically freely open up for us to tune our machine learning algorithm with their data? And I think if you asked 10 years ago, well, how is anyone going to publish all of the secrets behind a Bundesliga club, open access to everybody? Well, we've already broken that. And because if you go into Google Scholar and you look at all the people within our science department, we have multiple publications with all of the hidden secrets of all of the different attributes and data of all of the athletes within the club. And I think that if we are the first people to make this step, that we also can claim, the first movers are the ones that set the standards. And I really think that with our vision of trying to improve our technologies and our vision towards data and data analysis, I think that we will be the ones that are the first movers. Now, I know that this is much more common in pharmaceuticals or medical departments where they have more of a collated goal in order to try to share the data. And this is not yet done in football, as I know. So again, this might be one of those few years down the line projects. And 5 minutes. Okay. So in order to finish off with the presentation and to finish off with the IPO model, I wanted to take a case study about how we are actually developing technology across the years of the club in order to help improve our understanding of what information does the athlete take in the environment and how do we best kind of develop tools in order to help train or measure this. And so I'm going to be using what's known as the helix in order to tell this story. And so back in 2013, Professor Meyer, as you can see in the top left photo, he was one of those first movers of trying to integrate cognitive testing by use of iPads. There wasn't really much back in the day in order to help train the brain, but there is now. But back in 2013, you have to remember that this was almost pseudoscience, that lots of people mocked this type of behavior and said, this has no place in football. But he persevered, and one of the goalkeepers of the first team really believed that the computer training made him mentally strong. And so there was a lot of buy-in from the athletes as well. It could have been a placebo, could have not been, but it definitely helped get the ball rolling. The problem is that after years of using the iPads, there was a common kind of limitation of using this type of technology. And the athletes were coming in, they're saying, well, it's a little boring now after the hype is kind of finished. And it was getting very repetitive because there wasn't much variation within the cognitive training tools. And there was also speculation of, well, I don't really understand how these type of brain training games really transfer to on-the-field performance. And I don't really see the transfer the transfer of improvement on the field. And the problem with that is that in order to train the brain or the muscles for those that go to the gym, you need multiple sessions and you need to put a lot of effort in order to basically grow your muscles or your brain. It's the same. And so you need athletes to engage in the type of tools that you are using. And so Jan went to the drawing board in 2015 to the design thinking workshop, which was at the App House in SAP. And here's the actual first drawing, the conceptual drawing of a new and innovative tool that we wanted to build in order to better measure and train the athletes in a more representative assessment tool. And what that came to fruition was that there was this 180-degree curved screen that spanned over 7 meters in front of the athlete, over 2 meters tall. And the 6 projectors basically displayed what you can see in the top photo, which is where there was 4 athletes from one team, 4 athletes with a different jersey color. And then 2 of the athletes from each team would be selected, and then they would scatter all around the field. And then the player would have to track all 4 objects and then come back to the field. Now, maybe it sounds easy, maybe it doesn't. Let me tell you, I'm terrible at it, but athletes were getting really good at this. And what we were realizing was that it was differentiating between the higher level athletes and the lower level athletes from, external clubs, but it wasn't really good at having a high discriminant validity between the elite level athletes throughout the academy. And so what we needed to do was go back to the drawing board and come up with a new innovative tool with all of the lessons learned from the previous years of cognitive training and tried to take that next step. And so we came up with the Helix Arena, and obviously our conceptual design has got a lot better as well in recent years. And this is what's known as the Helix Arena. So it is a place where athletes can basically step into this new world. It's 360 degrees, fully immersive, not virtual reality, it's actual screens. And now that the avatars are running completely around them, in a 360-degree motion. And that's a lot more representative of how, let's say, a midfielder has to keep track of all of the defenders and the opponents and the teammates around them in a 360-degree field rather than the 180-degree field. And so this is the next level of technology. And what we're trying to also measure is through eye tracking glasses is what are they actually looking at? So what are the athletes that are really good at tracking the avatars? What are they looking at in the, I can play it again. It went by pretty quickly. Or maybe not, it's okay. What are the athletes looking at that are the best at this task? And what are the people that are not really good at the task? What are they looking at? And can we help the people who are not really good at this type of task transition to looking at the key areas of focus in order to help improve their cognitive performance? Now, I jumped a little bit ahead about this screen, but what you can see is that we're also developing software that we can use, not just the avatars, but some sort of training games. And so what this is we're taking the fundamental principles of how to train the brain of the athletes. And also, from a social perspective, we've had firefighters or stroke patients come in here as well and train with this. But what we're doing is we are overlaying the fundamental principles of science with a gamification. Because when we're talking about also the younger generation, we're talking about people who love technology, they love video games, and they want to be amused. They have very little attention. They can't pay attention a lot. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to design an environment where they actually come in and have fun and engage, and they will keep coming back, because that kind of consistency to train the brain, same as going to the gym consistently, is really where you get the performance, not just 1 week, but 10 weeks of adherence to this cognitive training. And so this is the type of innovative ideas that we are using, and we're currently publishing our research. So if anybody's interested, let me know. And so I guess the main takeaway message is that through 2013, there was this innovative approach to improving the brain. and it was often ridiculed and it wasn't a very common practice. But through perseverance and getting a lot of feedback from a scientific approach, so through experts in the field, through peer review of publishing our research and having people comment on what we're doing, we design, again, the next step. And then, so for where we are today, 7 years later, there's this really nice progression of actual innovation and development that you can see in these photos through how we have these lessons learned through our previous mistakes in order to get to where we are now. And I'm not sure what the next 5 years brings, but I'm hoping to come back in 5 years and then have a fourth photo below. But on that note, I'd like to thank you guys very much for your time, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you, Adam, for your amazing talk. I have to say, I got the honor to be in your Helix and play that game actually in a little challenge with one of our partners, Thomas Andres. I won't tell who won, but it was really fun. We have a lot of questions in the Slack and probably in the room, and just little time, so we will answer them one question in Slack, then hopping here into the audience. Maybe if we are lucky, we can invite you to the Slack channel afterwards so that the questions were not tackled here will be answered afterwards.
I can do that.
Perfect. So then let's start with the first question from the Slack channel by Ingo Birk. Aren't there some typical optimization for the individual versus optimizing for the team problems? For example, a defender who intercepts many passes looks good, but it could actually indicate that the defense has more to do than they probably should do. So you optimize for the interceptors, but the defense should be better.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think what we're talking about is we have data on scale, and it takes a lot of time and effort to pin that down to the individual. I think that's more along the lines of the coaching staff would be able to take control of that. So that's not my area. I'm a scientist. I can only inform the coaching staff about the data that we're seeing, but I can't make a lot of inferences on what they should do with that information. And I think that the coaching staff probably take the data from their players that they know really well, and they will be able to synthesize that with a lot more contextual information about, does this data make sense to the individual and what's really happening? And I think, so I can't comment necessarily on how we would do that as an individual, because I think that's more the role of the manager of the team itself. But good point.
Perfect. Thank you. Questions here in the audience?
Yes, I actually have a question. I mean, you're talking about training the brain as a muscle. So are there different time scales on which a brain is able to adapt to external stimuli compared to muscles? For instance, if I want to deadlift 150 kilograms and I deadlift 120, probably there's some heuristics how long that typically takes. But if I want to become more reactive in one of your metrics by 10%, are there some heuristics on, does it take longer than physical adaptation?
That's a really good question. What takes longer, to train the brain or the body? To be honest, I don't know. And the reason why we don't know is because it's only of recent late in the literature that has actually targeted to try to train the brain, specifically in the sporting domain. And there's a lot of publications out there that have actually been more unsuccessful in training the brain than being successful. So we haven't even got to the stage of where we really understand the best tools and equipment to train the brain like what we do in the physical parameters. And so I think you would have to check back in 10 years, unfortunately, because that really is the revolution of research in this area, is to try to train the brain. But to be honest, we don't know the answer of that question. And at the moment, lots of the research has only failed to train the brain accordingly. So unfortunately, that's how I have to answer the question. But very good point.
Then the next question is by Ruben Straube. Do you have a favorite single data point you look for in evaluating players or matches?
In matches?
Or players. So is there some specific data point where you say, well, that's my favorite one. If I want to evaluate if the match or the player is good, then I look at that data point, or is it always a sum of data points you need to evaluate?
Yeah, I would say from a cognitive perspective, there was one specific cognitive test that has stayed through the years. So with the slideshow that I showed you from the under 17s, and there was that 3 different diagnostic reports, actually the cognitive tests have changed throughout that because it's a lot of trial and error as to what cognitive tests we're using. But there's only one cognitive test that has remained and been useful throughout the test of time. And I would say that would be the number 1 point. And it's also a lot of the time where lots of athletes would also come in and only do that one specific test because we're still experimenting with the structure of the other tests and whether they're actually going to give us reliable information or not. So I would have to say it's that. What is that? It's a secret sauce. It's well, because researchers are always justified on the merits of how many people read their research. I highly suggest you go and read and find out for yourself, and that way I can get my metrics up. No, but it's a specific cognitive test called the determination test. It's basically the sustained attention and how it's basically a whole bunch of buttons, and then the screen says, okay, you have to push a red button, and then when you hear a tone, you have to push a gray button, and then there'll be left pedals and right pedals. So you're pretty much using this and pushing and listening to all these different sounds and auditory cues, and it can be very, very confusing. And it can, like us, we can all do it for maybe 2 minutes, but these people, it's an 8-minute test. And it's really about that consistency at the end as to whether they really start separating between performances, I would say. And so that's the test.
Another question here from the audience.
Do you think this kind of approach can also be applied to fields outside of sports that we consider to be like more creative or more heavily mental tasks, like maybe say creativity, like performance arts, or also even science and engineering?
I would say that through our recruitment process, we're still, because the research lab's pretty new, we're still trying to recruit lots of different people. And I'm not sure if we've really gone into those creative domains that you're talking about, but the areas that we have recruited, and as I mentioned, we're a non-for-profit organization, so we actually have to help areas of the society, and we've been recruiting firefighters. So they come in dressed in their firefighter suits, and we put them through a rigorous testing protocol, like a physically exhausting protocol, and then they have to go into this helix. And so we want to see how do they make decisions under pressure and under physical fatigue. We also have stroke patients, and we also want to know how are they interpreting information and processing information rather compared to the non-clinical populations. I think that with the test of time, we will be recruiting from different areas. And so if you have any specific people in mind, please come talk to me afterwards. If you have some sort of theories or hypotheses, we're always open to project collaborations. Thank you.
Looking at the time, I would suggest one question from the Slack. Okay, if the boss has more questions, then more questions. From the Slack channel, have you seen a difference in the effectiveness of your methods depending on the player? So offense versus defense, that one method works better for one type of player?
In the football, there are positional differences. So when we train athletes within the technical side, there are defenders or forwards or goalkeepers, and we would adapt the training to that. Whether it's the cognitive side, we haven't really found differences in playing positions yet. So it does seem to be, apart from goalkeepers, unfortunately, midfielders, defenders, and forwards all seem to have relatively similar cognitive abilities. And as I mentioned to your question, that there's more research that has failed to help train an athlete's brain rather than has been successful. And so to say that we should start breaking it down into individual playing positions is just too early in the research at the moment. But we will get to that frame, and we just need time.
Question from the audience?
You were talking a lot about the individual players and their data-driven performance optimization. What about the team? I mean, you showed us very impressively that the KPIs with you on television, with regards to the Brazil-Germany game, they're not too much deterministic on the outcome. What about the statistics about the whole team?
In terms of their collective cognitive performance? Oh, well, I'm being videotaped, so I have to be careful what I say. No, I would say when you're talking about Brazil versus Germany, they have very stereotypical types of creativity and non-creativity. I think Brazil's probably the most creative team, and it's been, I guess, stereotyped that the German team is not very creative. They're more methodological. Do we see that on a team basis as well? What I think I see from a team basis is that the variance between the teams becomes smaller as the team progresses through the ages. So I would say like the standard deviations or the confidence intervals become narrower with time. So they become more, I guess, in harmony within their cognitive processes rather than the younger age groups would have a lot more variance, because there's just so much differences in the younger age groups before we can really select the better people. And I think through that selection process, the team as in general is probably more in harmonious. Have I seen differences? The problem is that we can't really collect the data from another Bundesliga club as such. So, but I would really like to see that data be published. And that's why I come up here and talk about why more clubs should do this and really publish and give access and, open up the curtains to the backbones of their data, because this would really help to answer questions that you have and that I have as well. So if anybody has links to Bundesliga clubs, please push that agenda. But as of late, no, unfortunately not.
The Slack channel, the next one, actually suit there quite well. Obviously the KPIs for the Brazil-German match did not fix. They did not match to the outcome. Are there KPIs that were or are more suitable for that task?
Oh, good question. To be fair, if that person is a soccer expert, he will quickly find out that my knowledge of actual key performance indicators in football is very limited. I come from Canada and Australia, where I'm a lot more interested in the KPIs of ice hockey and baseball and stuff like that. So I would say he would have to narrow that question down more. I think the most common ones, I think the problem is that's an outlier, right? So I think that in general, the key performance indicators are believed because they're more consistent over time. The photo that I showed you is just an example as to why we can't put our full trust in observable actions. But I would say that if you, in general, these key performance indicators that I listed above can be quite trustworthy, and that's why the majority of football clubs use them. So I would say that it's more of an outlier that shouldn't change his whole aspect on key performance indicators being not important or important as such.
Perfect, thank you. Question from the audience?
Yeah, I actually have a second one. So you're talking about other sports as well. So, so you seem to be very focused towards soccer. So how's that systematic approach to this looking in other domains like ice hockey or even NHL? They have a really large budget in the US for sports.
Do you mean like the differences between the sports as such? Or do you mean like whether this should be applied to more like different domains rather than just football? Or
yes, basically the approach you take towards football, have you transferred it to other sports like ice hockey or NHL, NBA?
Well, I know for a fact that the German national team had a huge, or the DFB as such, had a huge push towards trying to understand American football. And they were visiting the American football because American football has a huge reliance on a data-driven approach as well. So I think maybe that we're not necessarily applying this to different domains, that more we're trying to learn what other domains are doing, such as American football, and applying it here. The danger in that is that the more you learn about how American football works, the more you get good at American football. And so there's this kind of internal struggle between should you just focus on soccer or should you actually apply external domains in order to help improve your sport as well. And I think that multiple people have different opinions on that. Should you apply the principles of soccer into an ice hockey with bigger budgets and stuff? And to be honest, I think that there is generalizability between the data-driven approach, especially if clubs are not taking that on. Like I know that there's a few clubs in the Bundesliga that don't even measure GPS or heart rate, for instance. I think they could have a good start. But I would say it's kind of difficult because it depends who you ask as to should you just spend your time getting better at soccer, or are you spending too much time getting better at just analyzing American football as such? So my personal opinion is, yes, we should generalize this, but have we? No, unfortunately not.
Next question from Michael Graf. In soccer, we love those moments when something extraordinary happens. Do those methods contribute in creating more or less of those moments? And how do those moments then back influence the method? On the other hand, he assumes that it's an optimization problem between finding a good solution most of the time and then finding the best solution in crucial situations. So do you somehow flat a bit the creativity of finding solutions in crucial situations, or is there anything like that?
That's a really good question. This is the question that I was not able to answer within my PhD, because what Mark was mentioning and the person that has asked the question is they're talking about the cognitive processes. So it's the middle part of the IPO model. When you're talking about creativity, they talk about being in flow. And I'm sure everybody has been in that stage of flow when they are working. Okay, it's no different from a football players. When you engage in this level of flow, most people have no conscious awareness of time or anything external around them because they're using their subconscious processes. And what's interesting is about the cognitive assessments that we're looking at is actually the complete opposite system, which is only their conscious processes. And so the theoretical problem with trying to use these cognitive assessments that only measure the conscious processes of the brain have not been able to have an impact in trying to measure whether that has any performance benefit in flow, which is a subconscious or a non-conscious process. And to me, I've posed this question in research often, is that we haven't really tackled this theoretical barrier, because when athletes are in the state of flow, then how can they be using their conscious processes? All right, maybe they're using their subconscious processes. And unfortunately, no one's given me an answer. Again, so if you do know the answer, please come and find me after work. Conference. But yeah, I think the problem with that is that there's still a theoretical barrier that separates the creativity, because I personally believe creativity is in the state of flow rather than our conscious controlled processes. And that's why I don't believe what we measures creativity.
We would come to the final question. Is there any urgent question from the audience? One last one.
So all your coaches in all the underage teams and so on, they work with your analysis day by day. At some point, they leave TSG, for example, they move on to another club. Do you know if they transfer all of these analysis, if they ask the new clubs to have the same things again, or do they go back to the more traditional ways to coach, to have insights?
That's a good question. So to be honest, I don't know, because I'm not friends with the coaches and I don't necessarily know what type of practices they engage in. But I mean, maybe Nagelsmann, who came up through the coaching ranks of Hoffenheim and now is obviously the head trainer for Bayern. I'm not sure if you guys as Bayern Munich fans maybe kind of see some sort of technological driven approaches, which we know he was. I can't answer whether he continues to apply that because I'm not in the club and see what his day-to-day practice is. But I would assume that, yeah. So what I do know is that the coaches that come to Hoffenheim, they have to agree with the philosophy that there's a data-driven approach, and they have to be open to that philosophy. And they have to agree that the data of their players and their coaching methods will be transferred to science and published online as part of our processes. And so from that perspective, only the coaches who already have that philosophy of that data-driven approach would probably even apply for the coaching academy as such. So I would assume, and I would like to think that that would also apply to when they leave the club itself, that they would only apply for coaching positions that continue to share their values as well. And a coach cannot come to Hoffenheim and overrule the values and the vision of the club itself. And I assume that's probably why they would either choose or not choose to come to Hoffenheim. A good question.
Okay, then I would say we end here the Q&A session. Let's thank again Adam for his amazing talk, also giving a small presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much.